In Detroit's peak, it was an industrial and commercial powerhouse, and at the center of it, a booming automotive industry. But over the past 60 years, Detroit has fallen into disarray and becoming a hotbed for crime, poverty, and urban decay, with lavish houses and buildings laying dormant or destroyed. Welcome to the Fewsaid channel, and this is what caused Detroit to fail. In 1699, French military leader Antoine Cadillac traveled in hopes to form a new settlement on the strait connecting Lake Erie to Lake Huron. This was due to back and forth between the French government over a Canadian expansion. With permission from the king in 1700, Cadillac arrived in Detroit on July 24, 1701. Cadillac and his 100 settlers began to construct a fort on the bank of the Detroit River. A church was founded and the parish was given the name St. Anne de Detroit. France offered free land to attract families to Detroit and reached a population of 800 by 1765. Besides Montreal and New Orleans, Detroit was one of the largest European settlements. Detroit's economy early on was based on the fur trade. Native Americans had important roles as trappers and traders. During the 7 Years' War, British troops gained control of the settlement and shortened its name to Detroit in 1760. Several Native American tribes laid siege to Fort Detroit in 1763. The siege failed, and France ceded all of its territory east of the Mississippi River to Britain. Following the American Revolutionary War, Britain ceded Detroit to the United States. In 1805, Detroit became the capital of the Michigan Territory. That same year, a fire destroyed the majority of the city. All residents in the affected area survived. During the War of 1812, the British captured Detroit, but was later recaptured by American forces in September 1813 following the Battle of Lake Erie. Detroit was incorporated as a city in 1815. As it expanded, a street plan was developed called the Woodward Plan. Though the plan was ambitious, it was discarded 2 years later for a grid layout. Detroit started to see success after the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825, making trade through the Great Lakes ever easier, introducing other cities to new industries such as Buffalo, Cleveland, and Chicago. The Civil War signified a major change in Detroit's economical landscape, from a source of agriculture to a major industrial hub. During the late 19th century, wealth from shipping and manufacturing saw the construction of Gilded Age mansions around downtown. People referred to Detroit as the Paris of the West for the architecture and wide boulevards. Detroit's population rose from 45,600 before the Civil War to 280,000 by 1900. In 1896, the thriving carriage trade prompted Henry Ford to build his first automobile in a workshop on Mack Avenue. 1903 marked the year when Henry Ford founded the Ford Motor Company. Ford, along with other automotive pioneers such as Chrysler, Packard, Dodge, and Chevrolet, established Detroit as the world's automotive capital. The growth of the auto industry was reflected with the development of service and gas stations as well as factories for parts. The auto industry also produced paints, metals, coppers, and brass. In 1907, the Detroit River carried 68 million tons of commerce, almost 4 times that of New York City. The Detroit River was dubbed the greatest commercial artery on earth by the Detroit News. By 1929, Detroit had become the 4th largest city in the U.S. with 150,000 working in the automotive companies. The automotive industry started to take its first major blows during the Great Depression. Before the Depression, there was as many as 18 different automotive companies, but by the end, it shrunk down to 3: GM, Chrysler, and Ford. After the formation of the United Auto Workers Union, improvements such as the 8-hour-a-day, 40-hour-a-week schedule, and increased wages and working conditions attracted migrants in the hundreds of thousands, particularly African Americans from the South. Despite Detroit being a northern city, racial discrimination was still prevalent. During World War II, the government encouraged modifying the automotive industry in support of the Allies. Jobs expanded so fast, 400,000 migrated to Detroit from 1941 to 1943. This also included 50,000 African Americans. The federal government prohibited discrimination in defense work, but when Packard promoted 3 black people to work on its assembly lines, 25,000 quit. This was followed up by the Detroit Race Riot of 1943, concluding with 34 deaths, 600 injuries, and over $2 million in damages. In the post-war era, 60% of all industries in the Detroit area were automotive. However, black residents were still treated unequally compared to the white residents. Black Detroiters were held in lower-paying positions, and government jobs only accepted white applicants, which created a power struggle. With these unequal employment and housing opportunities and overall lower incomes, were subject to worse housing. As the black population of Detroit kept rising, the already scarce amount of housing led to unsanitary, unsafe, and crowded living conditions. This became more evident in redlining policies implemented by the government and banks, which restricted the ability to improve their neighborhoods. White residents also opposed the influx of black people into white majority neighborhoods, pushing even more into the limited amount of available living quarters. Construction of the freeway system around Detroit and demand for suburbanization and cars were increasing dramatically. Similarly to other major U.S. cities, lower-income residents had entire neighborhoods demolished for these plans. These thriving neighborhoods were considered blind enough and had no consideration of the residents of these neighborhoods during demolition. With the rise in car ownership, the last Detroit streetcars were ripped out for buses in 1956. At the streetcars' peak, there was as many as 550 miles of track, with cars arriving at each stop every minute. These changes favored less dense, car-oriented suburbs rather than the denser, urban neighborhoods. Car factories moved as a result of the lower taxes, and the poor residents of Detroit could not reach the suburbs as cheap public transport was cut, along with heavy discrimination to those living in the city. As the sprawling suburbs around Detroit grew, the tax base in the city slowly eroded away. Between 1946 and 1956, General Motors spent $4 billion, Ford $2.5 billion, and Chrysler $750 million on new plants in the suburbs. In the 1960s, Detroit lost 10,000 residents per year as people moved, along with a 200,000 people drop from 1950 to 1960. MLK's I Have a Dream speech led to a growing civil rights movement along with federal civil rights laws in 1964 and 1965. This all came to a head on July 23, 1967, at a bar on Detroit's west side that resulted in one of the largest riots in U.S. history at the time. 43 died, 470 were injured, and 7,200 were arrested, and over 2,000 buildings were destroyed. This was one of a series of riots in the U.S. including Chicago, Milwaukee, New York, Rochester, and Birmingham, which became infamous and given the nickname the Long Hot Summer of '67. By 1969, Detroit's population dropped 20%, which was around 300,000 residents. In 1970, the NAACP sued officials for the state of Michigan, including the governor, for still enacting segregation in public schools. The court held all levels of government responsible and forced Detroit proper and their suburbs to desegregate. In November 1973, the first black mayor of Detroit, Coleman Young, emphasized on increasing diversity in government jobs, mostly law enforcement. He also worked to improve the transit in the Detroit metro, but led to heavy opposition from the suburbs. The federal government did fund $600 million into building a rapid transit network, but because of the antics of the suburbs, most of the funding was lost. The auto industry suffered major setbacks that impacted Detroit and its suburbs, the rise of OPEC. Along with the start of the oil crisis that affected the U.S. auto industry, buyers would rather choose cheaper, fuel-efficient cars made in Japan and Europe rather than American cars. Efforts were made to recover the sales, but ultimately thousands of employees were laid off and the remaining plants in Detroit were mostly closed, which further shrunk the tax base. Chrysler avoided bankruptcy in 1979 through a bailout. GM and Ford suffered majorly as well, leading them to slowly outsource to other countries. To revive downtown, Young built the Renaissance Center. He also gave support to large developers to attract the middle and upper class back into the city. Despite these projects, the downtown area continued to lose stores and hotels, and many large office buildings were vacant and decaying. Citizens away from downtown criticized the mayor for only focusing on the inner city and not the city as a whole. As properties became abandoned and the tax base was reduced, crime in the city began to rise. Crime reached its peak in Detroit in 1974 when over 700 murders were committed. From the mid-70s to the 1990s, Detroit was regarded as the murder capital of the country. In 1975, there was an estimated 500,000 firearms in Detroit. Detroit lost 5% of its jobs every year until 1992. The 1980s saw a small resurgence in the American automotive industry, but jobs were still leaving Detroit. As Detroit lost more people and as more went into poverty, the government enacted new taxes that made living in the city more expensive and unattractive to residents, leaving even more to leave. Arson became more and more of an issue throughout Detroit in the 1980s. In 1984 alone, 800 fires were set in the city, leading the mayor to describe it as a vision from hell. The population would fall even more, from 1.2 million in 1980 to falling under 1 million by the turn of the century. Violent gangs also took control over the now abandoned streets in Detroit, leading to a flourishing drug trade industry. In 2002, Kwame Kilpatrick was elected as the 72nd mayor of Detroit. In his first term, he used a city-used credit card to lease a Lincoln Navigator and purchase spa massages, expensive wines, and dinners along with the closing of the 100-year-old Bell Island Zoo and Aquarium. His expenditure in the first 3 years in this position totaled over $200,000. In 2005, Kilpatrick was rated as the worst mayor in America by Time magazine. Even though Kilpatrick was hated by Detroiters, he was still able to win the election with 53% of the vote. In 2007, Detroit filed their 2006 tax audits 14 months late, costing the city $2.5 million in the process. Kilpatrick took blame and stated it was because he laid off too many city accountants. Kilpatrick resigned following convictions of mail fraud, wire fraud, and racketeering, and in 2013 was sentenced to 28 years in prison. All of this cost the city $20 million in damages. During this time was the 2008 financial crisis. Unemployment in the city would reach as high as 30%, and the average house price would slump down to only $7,000. Residents living in Detroit abandoned their homes as they default on their mortgages. The county would seize homes for those who fell behind on their taxes and sell them off at annual auctions for as low as $1.
And we turn next to a big headline tonight out of America's iconic motor city, Detroit, waving the white flag, the city filing for bankruptcy.
This all came to a head on July 18, 2013, when Detroit became the largest city to file for bankruptcy. It was declared bankrupt by the U.S. District Court on December 3rd of that same year, with the city in over $18 billion in debt and unable to repay. 1 month after the bankruptcy was approved, the city was able to eliminate $7 billion of that debt and invest it into the city. By the end of 2013, there was roughly 90,000 abandoned homes. Many of them were victims of arson and scrapping. The financial crisis saw one of the largest exodus of citizens since the 1970s. The population dropped a further 200,000 to a measly 710,000. Over the past 10 years, Detroit has been taking action at revitalizing downtown and the surrounding areas. Buildings across the city that are once symbols for urban decay are being renovated and returned back to service. Decaying structures are being demolished at a record pace, but still significantly outdoing the pace of renovation and construction. But in this effort for economic recovery saw wage gaps between downtown and surrounding neighborhoods increase, along with higher rents and taxes. It is certain that Detroit's worst days are over, but only time will tell what will happen in the future.